Hello everybody, it's the Alco Diesel guy with another project for you for the Bachmann series. In this case, it's a u36b with the pancake motor on it. Anyway, let's get right to it and see what we have to work with here.
That's so great. Oh, this is bad. Ugh. Should be. Oh God, that's appalling. Yep. And that's what we call the cracked nylon gears, ladies and gentlemen. That's the sound of cracked nylon gears, I should say.
Okay, so we clearly have some work to do here. Anywho, let's open her up and go take a look as just what's a cookin'. To get in, we gently pull the shell away from the side of the chassis, which will allow the chassis to drop out from underneath it. Being careful not to damage the already somewhat weakened rear frames. I will say that the external parts of this locomotive are in pretty good shape. Let's hope the internals are the same. And here's the chassis itself. This is, again, one of the early production pancake motor chassis. It also has another strange quirk. It has this piece of styrofoam between the circuit board and the actual weights themselves. I don't know if this is something the previous owner did to somehow help it out. I also note the motor over there, as we can see, does not have resin over the actual screws that hold the pickups on, which indicates once again that someone's been here before me. So let's get right to it. The first step is going to be to get the motor out of the chassis itself. To do this, we're going to remove the screw right in the middle of the motor itself, which actually holds on a mount that holds the motor in place. With the mount out of the way, we can proceed on to the next step, which is going to be to release the two snaps that hold this in place, or clips. I call them snaps because of how they hold the motor in place. To do this, we need a screwdriver and some carefully applied pressure. And after a lot of persuasion, I finally get the pancake motor to separate from the chassis. We can now move on to the next step, and that is opening her up and seeing what we have to work with. The first step, of course, is to remove the two contact wires for the pickups. Note again that the brush springs are located directly under these metal contact plates that are held in place by those screws, so take great care in removing the plate, as the spring will be under tension and will be very likely to go flying if you're anything resembling aggressive with it. This isn't a good sign. Apparently this screw has been stripped out, showing that again someone's been here before me. However, after several different attempts with a pair of pliers as well as a few different screwdrivers, I was finally able to unlock the screw and get it free.
Oh, finally.
With that finally taken care of, we'll use a flat blade screwdriver to carefully remove the truck side frames to gain access to the actual motor drive assemblies, gear, and wheel sets. I began to notice that this whole assembly was over lubricated like crazy with oil, and that's not a good sign. Our next step is to carefully remove the wheel sets themselves to inspect the gear wheels, and unfortunately this is where the problems began to develop. As you can see, the gear itself can be rotated separately from the wheel itself, which indicates it is cracked or in some way or another failed. The same unfortunately can be said for the transfer gears. They've broken free from the metal shafts by cracking, thus expanding the plastic to where it won't grip the metal shaft, and therefore these must also be replaced as well. Again, the condition of the motor truck was quite appalling. It was over lubricated like crazy with oil everywhere. Even more evidence of just how bad things were was revealed as I undid these screws to open the actual motor itself up. Please note that these two screws actually still had the resin on them, which allowed me to come to my final conclusion, which I will give in just a second here. And as we open the shell of the motor itself up, we can see exactly what I was talking about. Again, the internals here are laden with oil everywhere. The magnets, the armatures, the commutator, the gears, everything. In a case of almost ridiculous irony, there was no oil where it actually needed to go, and that was where the axles sit in these plastic slots. Things only got worse when I pulled the commutator out of the other side of the shell. As you can see, while the armatures look fine, the back, well, oh boy. This may look, initially I thought this was just black, the blackness was caused by just simple carbon buildup, but as it turns out it was something worse. Anyway, I continued to proceed on the sort of optimistic principle that I was going to be able to fix this by using a little conductive lubricant to go ahead and clean down the commutator and get it to turn into something resembling usable. This is also unfortunately where I discovered the true cause of the commutator turning black. Now, while there was a noticeable amount of carbon buildup, there was, unfortunately, as we see here, some very clear burn marks in the commutator itself. Obviously, no matter what I do in terms of polishing is going to get rid of those. Essentially, this motor was pretty badly cooked. If it did run, it wouldn't run very well, but I decided to keep proceeding to see what I could do with it. I could now conclude my hypothesis was correct. Someone attempted to disassemble this motor, and failing to get all the way inside, decided to take the easy way out and simply stick some regular oil right down through the holes where the brush plates are. The end result, they flooded the whole motor area out with this oil, and unfortunately some of it made contact with the commutator and physically caused it to burn and get singed. Anyway, I decided to proceed as normal just to see what I could get out of it. I went and applied some conductive lube to the actual bearing itself, as well as around the commutator. This is the one kind of lubrication that is safe around this area. And then placed the motor back in place, making sure that the brushes were also in the proper location, which is something, as you can tell from this shot, I nearly forgot. Once I managed to finally get both brushes in position, and I don't envy anyone who's doing this task because believe me, it's not easy, I placed the commutator back in position. Mind you, again, this was lubed before, right back into the hole where it was. Again, making sure that the brushes make contact with the commutator side and that the armatures are exposed on the top. It really is a shame that someone decided to pump this thing full of oil. Again, I surmise this was done because of the rough running underneath, which was caused by two cracked gears, as we found. Unfortunately, all the oil flooding the commutator out in the gear system did, etc., was to damage the motor further. Unfortunately, at this point, I would reach an impasse that I couldn't get past in any way, shape, or form. You may recognize that black gear and the other one I'm about to show you from the F9, more precisely the chassis system F9 I disassembled previously to try to fix its motor and found it to be completely destroyed. I thought these would simply drop in. Unfortunately, the metal shafts are actually slightly wider and the gears themselves are slightly shorter. This meant that the gears would not talk to each other no matter what I did with them. The other issue I had, of course, is that I didn't have any more parts for that specific type of pancake engine. These were all I had left, and so basically this motor could not be repaired at this point. And please pardon the rough angles of the camera footage, but unfortunately this is what I have to work with. And while it was very clear that this chassis could not be saved, at least not at this point, I did have a backup plan. I had acquired another u36b pancake chassis online. I initially bought this and bid on it, thinking that I was getting another all-wheel drive chassis. As it turns out, though, this is in fact another pancake chassis. It appears to still be on the earlier side, as it still says made in Hong Kong rather than China, as the later production models were. As you can see by the body, it is clearly an ugly duckling with parts kind of strewn all over the place and broken. And if we look closely at the body shell itself, it's actually cracked right along the front there on the nose. In fact, this whole assembly is literally hanging on by a thread. Again, let's take a look at her underneath the hood. To do so, we're just simply going to pull the shell carefully away from the chassis to drop it out of position, just like we did before on the Santa Fe version of this locomotive that we've been working on. As we can see, this is clearly an earlier variation of the chassis. It lacks the directional light board that the Santa Fe variation of the unit we were working on before had, and at the same time, the Santa Fe, interestingly enough, only had one headlight attached to that particular unit. It's not clear as to why, or if this just broke off with age. Now, before I go through all the trouble of tearing this motor apart, let's see if it works, and if it does work, how well it works.
Let's see what we have to work with here, which is on the track. Let's turn the power on and see if she'll move Actually, it's a pretty good runner. I'm not going to even...
And yep, it appears that this may have been an ugly duckling on the outside, but very clearly a swan on the inside.
Someone's actually updated this to a knuckle, I just noticed. That's interesting, although there's no spring on it, so I may have to change that out.
And in case you haven't guessed it yet, yes, I'm going to simply put the Santa Fe shell on this chassis to fix the engine.
Make this a usable
It
engine.
simply doesn't make any sense to tear apart this perfectly good running locomotive to fix one that's broken, and even if I did get it running, would probably never run correctly again. Very clearly, whoever owned this locomotive before me took very good care of it. It was properly lubricated and had some nice upgrades done. So while the shell is a disaster, the same can luckily not be said for the internal chassis itself. Now, before I go any further with this project, I'm going to give the shell a little love. I'm going to use one of those Clorox and disinfecting wipes to clean it up. I find that these are the best for dealing with older vintage shells, as they won't take the paint off, but they will attack the dirt and get rid of it very quickly. I went very thoroughly over this locomotive as it did have quite a bit of filth on it. The next and final detail I did was pretty extreme. I took the Q-tip swab you saw me clean the commutator, and please note I didn't apply it directly. I wrapped it in the actual Clorox wipe and then put that in all the tight little nooks and crannies by the railings, just so I can get every last bit of that dirt and dust out of the way. Finally, with the thorough cleaning done, it was time for me to deal with the coupler issue. As it turns out, the pin where the spring mounts to the coupler itself was broken off. It's not clear how this happened. I'm assuming this engine had been sitting in storage for a while and was unfortunately not stored quite right, although not in the worst case scenario, as we saw it is in pretty good shape. And so I dug out a new KD coupler, went ahead and attached that to the truck, and that solved the problem. And here's a shot of the finished product, and doesn't she look beautiful? And of course, the next and final step is to give her a test to see how she runs.
Move the camera into range, turn the power on. If she runs well enough, I'm just going to leave it like that. No sense in messing with something. If it works, don't fix it. This ain't broke, so I ain't fixing it. Looks like whoever owned this thing gave it a recent maintenance on it. I was told at least that they went through the drivetrain, so that makes sense. So now I've salvaged one, though I'm not so sure they really did. Anyway, this will work fine, so that'll take care of it. Alrighty then, on to the next one.
And that's going to do it for this project. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If not, a thumbs down. Please subscribe, and again, as always, keep the metal side down.